Who's your commander?
Good luck.
Equip.
Move to combat.
Resolves.
Now, before you attack
Does
me,
anyone have an answer?
well played.
Good game.
Hello, Magic players. This is Jumbo Commander, and I have some spicy tech for you today. We're going to explore a card interaction that's a little bit confusing, and in doing so, not only can you add this to your commander decks, but also, hopefully, you will gain a deeper understanding of the rules of Magic. So let's jump right in. Today we're going to talk about Exile effects, specifically the evolution of Exile effects that Magic has implemented. And two of the best examples of this are in Fiend Hunter and Banisher Priest. So let's read these Exile effects and then explain how they can be used and abused. Fiend Hunter reads, when Fiend Hunter enters the battlefield, you may exile another target creature. When Fiend Hunter leaves the battlefield, return that exiled card to the battlefield under its owner's control. Let's read Banisher Priest. When Banisher Priest enters the battlefield, exile target creature an opponent controls until Banisher Priest leaves the battlefield. Now, these seem very, very similar, and if you're not paying close attention, you'd think they're identical cards, but they're really not. Banisher Priest is more modern, and it basically fixes an exploit in the rules that Fiend Hunter created. Fiend Hunter has two separate paragraphs. That means it has two individual triggers, and they trigger at different times. It has an ETB trigger, and it has a leaves the battlefield trigger. While Banisher Priest only has a single trigger. Banisher Priest does what Wizards really wants it to do, and Fiend Hunter, well, is exploited because of the rules. Let's get a little bit deeper into this, and the way that we get into this is through a sacrifice effect, like Ashnod's Altar. So let's cast our imaginary Fiend Hunter, and let's pretend we have an Ashnod's Altar on the battlefield. So when Fiend Hunter enters the battlefield, it creates a trigger, and that trigger goes on the stack. The trigger reads, when Fiend Hunter enters the battlefield, you may exile another target creature. It's important to note that people can respond to triggers, and that makes sense. You play your Fiend Hunter and people are like, oh wait, no, and they do stuff before you have a chance to exile their creature. But you also get to respond to that trigger, so let's respond to your own Fiend Hunter trigger by sacrificing it to Ashnod's Altar, creating 2 colorless mana. We don't care what we're doing with this colorless mana, and it doesn't have to be Ashnod's Altar, it could be any sacrifice effect. What happens then is that there ends up being another trigger. When Fiend Hunter leaves the battlefield, return the exiled card to the battlefield under its owner's control. So what's happened is that we have these triggers out of order. Because we resolve the stack from top to bottom, then we have to return a card that doesn't exist. Okay, basically that trigger goes poof and nothing happens. Then as you go down and resolve things further down the stack, you have to exile target creature. So what this does is you can exile a creature and it will never return because the ability that lets it return has already happened. You basically exploit Fiend Hunter's 2 triggers to make them happen out of order, and so that creature is exiled forever. Now, why doesn't this same thing work on Banisher Priest? Well, let's do the exact same setup. We cast a Banisher Priest, we make sure we have Ashnod's Altar on the battlefield, and Banisher Priest has a trigger when it enters the battlefield. And then if you try to respond to the trigger by sacrificing the Banisher Priest goes away, and that same trigger is still left on the stack. When Banisher Priest enters the battlefield, exile target creature an opponent controls until Banisher Priest leaves the battlefield. Guess what? All of that stuff doesn't get broken apart. It resolves all at once in one big go, and so Banisher Priest has left the battlefield, so essentially you've done nothing. That's what happens when the leaves and enters is tied together into one paragraph. It happens in one go, and you can't stack them like you can with the Fiend Hunter. We've seen this evolution on multiple cards. If we go back in time to cards like Mesmeric Fiend or Tide Hollow Sculler, you can see that they have 2 separate triggers, but the more modern Brain Maggot has only a single trigger. You can see this same effect on Oblivion Ring. 2 separate statements, 2 separate triggers, and Banishing Light, a single trigger. So if you have a sacrifice outlet for enchantments like Claws of Gix, it pays to run an Oblivion Ring over a Banishing Light just out of the corner case that you can exploit this effect. There's one more old school card I want to mention that exploits this effect, and that's Angel of Serenity. Look at those 2 triggers there, and it hits 3 different things. Now, this is not something that you can just say, oh, this is an old thing in Magic and I'll forget about it, because this effect was just relevant recently. Spell Queller is a modern card. It was just a couple sets ago. It was just in Standard. And Spell Queller has these same 2 statements on it. When Spell Queller enters the battlefield, exile target spell with converted mana cost 4 or less. When Spell Queller leaves the battlefield, the exiled card's owner may cast that card without paying its mana cost. And so if through a sacrifice outlet you can misstack these triggers, you could exile a spell forever. Now there's one more cool interaction when it comes to exile effects and Commander, and this was something that actually blindsided me. I was making a video and I said something wrong because I didn't know this rule, and it's amazing. So let me go through it. If you have a commander and your commander is going to be exiled by an effect, well, you know you have the choice to either leave it underneath that effect or send it to the command zone. You kind of always have the option to send your commander to the command zone if it's going to change zones in any way. And so if your commander is faced with exile under an Oblivion Ring, you are faced with a choice. Do I want to put my commander under this Oblivion Ring and hope that it'll get blown up and I'll get my commander back on the battlefield for free? Or do I want to use a replacement effect to make sure that my commander goes back to the command zone so that I can continue casting it, even if it is for that extra commander cost? Oblivion Ring makes the player make the choice because it has 2 separate triggers. But when it comes to more modern cards, like say its equivalent Banishing Light, you technically have a choice, but really you don't, because there's some interesting tech. So Banishing Light enters the battlefield and tries to exile your Anala. What you need to do is apply your replacement effect, and so instead of banishing it under the Banishing Light, essentially, it goes back to the command zone. Still in exile, essentially. Now, when Banishing Light leaves the battlefield, you might think, my commander is stuck in the command zone. But oh no. Banishing Light, because it's a single trigger, remembers that it banished it into exile in the command zone, and your Anala comes back onto the battlefield. Wait, what? Yeah, I didn't know this, and I did research, and it's amazing. So you essentially get the advantage of having your commander in the command zone, but also, just in case that Banishing Light gets blown up, you can bring it right back into play. And that is directly attached to these triggers being combined into one paragraph in Banishing Light, and that's why it doesn't work that way with Oblivion Ring. And that means as more and more of these effects are produced in Magic, the more opportunities we have to exploit that in Commander. So I'm going to repeat myself for clarity's sake. If you have a commander on the battlefield, and someone casts an exile effect that has a single paragraph where the exile and the return to the battlefield are combined together in one paragraph, one trigger, then you should always send your commander to the command zone, because essentially what you've done is you've replaced the text where it says exile with Banishing Light to exile to the command zone. And because that's all combined into one trigger, when Banishing Light happens to leave the battlefield, it will remember the permanent that was exiled by it and then allow it to return to the battlefield, even though it was exiled in the command zone versus exiled somewhere else, usually denoted by being placed behind the enchantment. Now, I mentioned that the enchantment, quote, remembers where Anala went even though it was a replacement effect. So if you cast your commander again, or it ends up in another weird place, then the enchantment won't remember it anymore and you'll lose that advantage. But the key is flexibility. You have the ability to cast it again from the command zone if you want to, and give up on the opportunity of it entering the battlefield for free, or you can keep it in the command zone hoping that the Banishing Light will get exploded somehow, and then boom, commander back on the battlefield for no extra cost. So I hope that this explanation helped you understand the rules of Magic a little bit better without me actually mentioning rules. The game of Magic is super complicated, and there isn't really a good place to learn it and learn these weird rules. And so if you can learn a little bit at a time, and if I can help you out, I think that that will make you a better Magic player, but also reduce some of the anxiety and the frustration that comes with loving a game and not truly understanding everything about it. All right, everyone, my name is Jumbo Commander, and I made this video because I've launched a Patreon. I'm super excited to make all sorts of different content and really branch out about all the cool stuff that Jumbo Commander can do. And I'm doing this because of the support of great people who have always been here watching my videos, subscribing, and now there are people directly contributing to this channel's growth. So thank you, and if you think that this is something you want to be involved in, go ahead and click on, there are going to be a ton of Patreon links, so click somewhere, check it out, and more than anything, I'm just really happy you joined me for this video. Thanks so much, and I'll see you really soon.